Pennsylvania felt like a place of exile. Anxious for a sense of belonging, but mainly eager to make something from my time there, I formed the idea of the buried book. I had to make do with the offerings in the arts and crafts section at Walmart, as it was the only store in Tioga County with the necessary materials. I stripped commercially packaged art supplies for their parts. Pages were torn from a coil-bound sketchbook. I trimmed off the perforated ends of the paper with a carpet knife. To make end leaves, I peeled heavy watercolor paper from a glue-bound tablet. For the cover material, I took a pre-stretched painting canvas, unwrapped it from its cellophane packaging, and pried the staples from the canvas stretcher bars using needle-nose pliers. The backing chipboard from the sketchbook and watercolor tablet provided the hardcover boards. A lightweight cord sewed the pages together. I assembled the book at a tiny desk in the corner of the kitchen. Thick white craft glue adhered the end leaves and cover material to the chipboard. Holes were bored through the book block so I could stitch it together with the cord. All of this was done without skill or patience. By economizing all the materials, the paper and fabric grains went the wrong direction, and my binding was too tight, leaving the front cover stubbornly ajar. It was a consumer art supply Frankenstein monster with its mouth partially open. Waking early the next morning, I exited the house with the slam of the wood-frame screen door behind me. Walking with the shovel in one hand and my monster in the other, it was the first time I ventured beyond the little pond my landlord had dug himself, where he had told me one blue heron would return for a few days each fall as it made its way south for the winter. Marching with intention, I headed toward the tree line where a small herd of deer would frequently forage, camouflaged by the tall, tan grasses. The night before, as I lay awake in bed, I had imagined following a clear path meandering its way through the forest, but in the reality of the woods I could not see the ground for the wild, green growth striking my shins. Branches and leaves slapped and scratched me all over my body. My hands full, I tried to swat at tiny gnats and bugs by flailing elbows and knees to keep away the irritating swarms. Prickly plants clawed at my pant legs. Underfoot twigs snapped loudly enough to scare me. Sweating and desperate, I came to a patch of ferns that immediately reminded me of Anselm Kiefer works I had seen in library books. He used fern fronds as both material and symbol in large book sculptures and paintings. Wishing the walk to end, I took the ferns as a sign for me to plant the book in a neighboring patch of ground. Giving little consideration to the white book at rest in the dark brown soil, I covered it in a thin blanket of the stony dirt and walked away without looking back.
This is Brockport Writers Forum.
Good morning. We're very pleased to have with us today Derek Walcott.
Our guest today is John Barth.
Our guest today, Rita Dove.
Welcome Grace Paley to Brockport.
The writing of Isaac Bashevis Singer. The poetry of Robert Hayden.
Our very special guest today, Lucille Clifton.
Nadine Gordimer. The poetry of Anne Sexton. Today, the poetry of Seamus Heaney.
I wonder if you'd like to read a section from the novel.
Welcome to the television studios of SUNY Brockport and to the first interview of the Spring 2025 Writers Forum Visiting Writers Series. I'm Austin Bush, co-director of the Writers Forum and a professor in the English department at SUNY Brockport, and I'm happy to introduce Tate Shaw. Tate is a practitioner and a critic of the artist book. His own books, which we'll talk about today, are housed in collections around the world, including the Tate Modern in London, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago Joan Flasch Artist Book Collection, and Yale Special Collections, among others. His critical writings have appeared in numerous edited collections and journals, including the Journal of Artist Books and Aperture's Photo Book Review. Tate has served for much of his career as director of SUNY Brockport's Visual Studies Workshop, and he currently works as an associate professor and the director of the Tower Fine Arts Gallery here at SUNY Brockport. So, welcome, Tate.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Starting with what you just read, that passage from the ground, and the images which were displayed from around the same point in the book as that passage. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what artists' books are, and you know, ultimately even I'd like you to talk to us about the relationship between the book that you describe making in the ground and the ground itself, right? And so I'm curious, like, what are artist books? How do you understand them, and what sort of work do you do when you're producing them?
So artist books really have been around since people created anything. You know, so you could look to forms that were portable, that had any kind of inscription upon them, that you know, were capable of creation and expression for humans. And in their most recent, you know, iteration in the last, say, 50 years, they've been thought of as more of a means and an end. So a way out of a system where art gets exhibited in a museum or a gallery space or something that's more formal institutionally, to a way for a democratic means for dissemination of artworks, and it then therefore becomes an end where the work is the material and the end goal, as opposed to a sort of container for content, if you will. And so the reason that passage is interesting in discussing this is I physically made in that project, The Ground, I physically made a book of all white paper that I meant to make a physical artist's book work, where I was going to bury this thing in the ground, and then I was going to go back every day for however long and turn a page, and the ground was essentially going to write this book, if you will. The material ground was going to write this book. What happened is I just left it there, and then I pulled it out a month later, and I did end up making some images from that, you know, physically printed work. You know, the soil becoming kind of like the printing plate to the book becoming like the paper, and time being the printing press that made that thing kind of come together. But it became more interesting as a conceptual work, looking back upon that project a dozen years later, after that particular area where I had buried the book had been transformed to what was a kind of tourist economy for people to go and experience some nature, and that was essentially all there was. There was some golfing and some hunting and other things, but it turned into a fracking economy where, you know, people were mining the ground literally for natural gas, and that forest was a spot that I returned to later on and then documented that. And so the imagery in The Ground, this new version, the book, is all from mining sites in Pennsylvania and other places, painted with water and digital photographs, you know, printed.
So it's paintings of ground in the area, but it does also have in certain images in particular, almost look like it just could be sort of like an imprinting of the ground on the page.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So the original was that. Yeah. So when I originally pulled up the book, I'd scanned the pages that had been, you know, printed by The Ground.
Yeah.
The second version was me going back to those sites. We just saw the picture of the fern patch where basically I had buried that book. I don't know the exact location, but photographed, and then I printed those photographs with a really crappy inkjet printer. It was a fugitive dye-based ink, so I could then paint the digital prints that came out, enacting a kind of ground-like process where the ground of the image gets moved and washed away, and so there enacts this kind of like metaphor of what happens in the mining process. There's a lot of wastewater with mining, particularly in fracking, where it's like, you know, full of chemicals, and it's there's a way in which there's a play on mining and using. In this case, I talked a lot about a sort of complicity with that practice of using the earth for energy. In my case, it was a creative energy that I was trying to pull from.
Yeah, it does seem in reading it, and we still almost haven't really talked about that aspect of artist books, the language, right? The discourse in them. But certainly in that episode that you read, it seems to become like a metaphor of extracting things from the earth. And, you know, as the story goes on and that book becomes this sort of infectious, like, incubator of mold spores that, you know, infect other books and things like that, it becomes interesting. But it's also, like, they're just kind of throughout the book, there are images and ideas of things being extracted from the ground. Energy, some that seem more sort of thoughtfully constructed processes, some perhaps less so. But even things like when you live underground or have a basement, the idea that the basements extract water from the ground and how that can be a problem, and it sort of surfaces throughout. So, and can you talk a little bit about the idea of the book as a metaphor for extraction?
Sure, absolutely. So it really was spawned by going to Iceland, strangely enough. So I with my now spouse, she had gone to Iceland and I went with her to Iceland for a sort of research project and saw geothermal practice. So the geothermal mining where, you know, the ground becomes the source and the sink for energy, where, you know, it's all one temperature, more or less. And so you dump, you know, cold air into it for the, you know, you're trying to heat. In Iceland, they heat like a vast array of their homes with, you know, just ground energy. And so it was, it spawned this notion of, again, like this kind of complicity question of like my own use of the ground. And I was trying to be like, you know, John Cage or Thoreau or somebody and experience this kind of like a conceptual catharsis of being in the environment. But in essence, what I had to use and what I had the capacity for at that time was what I could extract from Walmart, and the means that were necessary got me to that point. So that sense of I think of all those products as being like kind of, you know, sort of tainted with fossil fuels in their own way, and then, you know, me essentially doing that work of pulling from life. You know, there's a lot of in all the work, there's a lot of memoir kind of quality to it, where they're not quite memoir, they're not quite diaries, but they essentially are using stories to pivot off of these metaphorical points that I think have greater impact, you know, for the work.
Yeah, that sort of interests me, your description of the work, because it does seem there's a sense in which the ground, it's sort of structured as, you know, your original visit to this area in Appalachia, right? And then sort of your return to it, like sort of as a visitor, and how it's changed. Whereas originally you felt this place, but you were actually living there, right?
I was actually living there. Right. Felt, you know, as I mentioned in that passage, it was a early 20s existence where, you know, I tried a life. It didn't go so great. Exiled there for a time and was trying to understand it, and, you know, using what I could to make that happen. And there's a, you know, a bit of a questioning of like kind of the religiosity of nature in it, you know, where like I talked about like Thoreau, and trying to have an experience that would yield something from that exile time. I had seen some work by John Cage that I mentioned earlier, where he made work out of smoke, where essentially like lighting something on fire and rolling a printing press over the top of it, and whatever had emitted onto the page becomes like dusted with the smoke. And, you know, so I was trying to do something that I didn't have to make any decisions as I put it in the work, because, you know, at an early 20s age, you know, you're maybe not able to make a lot of decisions, or you're in a state of not. So like pulling from life has been a part of it, a part of the process.
Yeah, and it, I mean, so that's interesting. It's something I'd like to talk to you about, especially when we move to some of your more recent work. the idea of memory or memoir, sometimes almost sort of sentimentalized memory, like almost nostalgia, although it's slightly more complicated than that. I don't mean to suggest that it's simplistic, but I already see in the ground you kind of questioning that, because in that first visit, where, as you said, like, you know, your idea is sort of Thoreau-like, to kind of create a life with nature. But then so much of what you describe is like I remember the trash pit, right?
Yeah.
You know, this just sort of almost apocalyptic environment in the middle of nature. And then when you come back in the context of fracking, like, you have this description of this sort of almost beautiful just green bed of grass, right? Like, and it's really sort of like, it seemed to me it was sort of interrogating like this superficial understanding of what we think nature is, or it should be. And I just thought that was interesting, and there were parallels to the way we think about our past and a sort of superficial excavation of it.
I mean, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I would say that some of the materiality does that a lot too. Is watercolor, the way in which the way in which the images are playing with the ink, and the traditional notion of like the sublime being like this kind of thing where you're drawn in, but you're also horrified, disgusted by it and terrified by it. That is essentially my experience of a lot of those landscapes, where even going back when it was more overtaken by natural gas production, I would stand on the roof of my car to make pictures so I could get at different angles. And it was like absolutely, beautiful to see this pool of flat water, but then to know that it was completely rife with all the chemical slurry that had come out of the process of fracking. And so I think that the materiality of the watercolor kind of plays in on that a little bit, where you're kind of drawn in perhaps by the lusciousness of some of those pages, and purposefully chosen like soft paper and ways in which the printing ink would just like really fold into the page. And then there was a kind of recoil when you realize, oh, that's a sulfur mine, or he's talking about, the writer, the narrator talking about, something that is like an underground coal mine fire in Pennsylvania. But the beauty itself, the only real thing you see is the mist and what is coming off the ground from the heat underneath. Well, and so that's eye-opening to me, because in some of the images, you do have this very peaceful, beautiful sort of, watercolor veneer, if that's a way to describe it. But then, sort of like within cracks, you see fragments of factories or of the production of fossil fuels, and it's actually sort of becomes part of the beauty of the picture, but it's also disrupting the picture at the same time, right? And that's basically the idea. And so there's no sense of there being a flatness. It's always going to have that tension, where it might be quite exquisite and draw you in, but it would also kind of repel you away somehow.
Well, I really love the ground. I remember when I first encountered it a few years ago, how moving I thought that it was, and revisiting it with students and with other readers in the context of your visit, I've found the same thing. But it really, it's sort of this time around, it really raised this question to me, and it's a kind of straightforward question, but I'm just curious as to how you answer it. Right? I introduced you as a critic and a practitioner of the artist book, right? Do you consider yourself a writer?
I mean, so this is a good question, and I think a fair one. When you asked me to be part of the Writers Forum, I was like, all right, so I guess maybe I am a writer? I don't know. But
all right, we've decided.
It's a hat, I put on. I think when I started making books, I didn't have that kind of question of whether I was going to write. It became something I desired to do because I wanted to see type on the page. And there was an experience of reading that I thought, in a performative way, that I thought was necessary, that I wasn't getting through making books material on their own. And so I literally just worked at teaching myself and taking workshops here and there to try to become more of a writer as a process of being an artist, and then reading a lot of books, I started to have ideas about what those books would be and would be about, or what I could say about them. I was always still very interested in like what metaphors are there and how metaphors of reading come through, and particularly in artist books. They kind of teach you how to read them. Oftentimes there's a materiality to them in a metaphorical way that if you don't get that kind of as a puzzle piece or a key, then you might not catch the whole thing that is going on with it. So exploring metaphors for reading became something that I was really interested in doing with writing, and as criticism grew, more language starts to filter into the books, and now it's like probably 2/3 writing, 1/3 imagery, and there's a big shift in a sense. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, to sort of shift topics, I want to go to a passage of the book, and I won't read it, but I will describe it. It's when you're speaking of your ex-father-in-law and his congregation, which it's a very sort of religious insider moment where the congregation makes a decision to move towards away from a traditional sort of worship service where hymns were central to a more contemporary form where there were more popular forms of music, and how your father-in-law, who's the pastor of this church, was sort of found himself excluded, right, from the congregation.
Pushed out,
pushed out as it.
This was happening a lot in the late 1990s to early 2000s, where like the contemporary shift, from like past liturgical expression to more, electric guitars and drums and stuff.
Exactly, and it's a very sort of insider kind of Christian moment, right, that you know about and that you write about, and it becomes part of this sort of metaphor of displacement, right, that that economy. But I was just wondering if you would just speak just for a minute or two about religion as a theme in your writings, as a way to launch into some of your more recent work, which deals with it explicitly.
So that's a good question. I am not particularly religious now, but was raised very much in an evangelical Southern Baptist frame, where everything about my community, my family, my experience was through religion. So if I was to go to, say, like the Boy Scouts, it wasn't the Boy Scouts, it was the religious version of the Boy Scout. It was essentially like a split existence that I had coming up, where in a personal way I grew up with this feeling that was a community, and my sense of art and community really came from religion, but then moved into a lot of other forms of expression later on. So people talking, getting up and talking was a big way of experiencing culture. In a Baptist tradition, there's no images, so they exclude, purposefully exclude images, and so some of the stuff that I was interested in, like comic books or pop culture imagery, was like contraband in the religious, connotation. So there was like always a kind of tension between how that worked. So I think a big time theme is redemption that comes through a lot, and that sense of like pulling out a buried thing that was resurrected from some sort of sense of death into a new frame. That tends to follow a lot of what I think about and write.
Okay. Let me pause you for a minute, and we will go to a break and then come back and talk about this more fully with reference, especially to your contemporary writers, to your contemporary work. So we'll be right back. Please take a minute or two to watch these informational videos about life at SUNY Brockport.
Have you ever been scared to walk around on campus? Hi, I'm Amanda, a student at SUNY Brockport. I have a solution for you. The University Police Department is committed to your safety. We have a student-run patrol program that provides secure rides to those in need. We pride ourselves on crime prevention and providing a safe environment for students, faculty, and visitors. We also have other resources such as blue light phones and monitored safe exchange zones. Contact us at our non-emergent phone number or our campus escort line, keeping you in mind to prevent crime.
Looking to play baseball without it having been the center of your college attention? Well, I'm Joey Campbell, and I have a solution for you. The club baseball team at Brockport looks to compete in tournaments and games, all the while having great flexibility within student schedules. No curveballs. Don't strike out on this opportunity. Are you looking for more information? If so, slide over to our Instagram at Brockport Club Baseball and message us if you're interested in joining the team. See you on the diamond.
Are you a student or faculty member at SUNY Brockport and struggle with food insecurity? Prior to the pandemic, students took a survey and it was discovered that 45% of Brockport students could not afford food, leading them to being unable to focus on their studies. The pantry located in Daly Hall on campus offers various options from canned and frozen food to refrigerated items. The pantry works hard to prevent hunger across all individuals on campus. Stop by the pantry to grab your essentials to ensure that you are thriving here at SUNY Brockport. The pantry's got your back.
A lot of people like to go to the cafe. But what is the real reason students go to the cafe? To get caffeinated. Come to the Rajmadan Cafe. We have everything to help you wake up and be motivated to complete those assignments. We have gourmet coffees and a varied tea selection. So no matter what you're looking for, we have you covered. Grab lunch or dessert to help you during your study session. Come visit us at Rajmadan Cafe in the Drake Memorial Library. I'm Harley Thomas and Amanda Wells produced this message. Please caffeinate responsibly.
So you were sharing about religious themes in your writing, and really you answer the question autobiographically, right? That's part of who you are. It's part of, or it was part of how you were raised, and it's actually part of like how you became an artist and what your approach to art is. And maybe could I ask you to talk about what seems to me your most complicated work. It's God Bless This Circuitry, and I think we have some images of it. And it's one of your explicitly religious texts, or texts that's dealing with religion. And I was wondering if even just describing it, like, is an effort, right? Do you want to? Would you talk about this?
Yeah, no, it's a complicated thing. So, and it's kind of all right there in the title where it becomes complicated. That it says, "God bless this circuitry" is a sort of non sequitur, in a way, and it came about during this period post 9/11 when I remember God Bless America was everywhere. So God Bless America would be on like cigarettes, and God bless this, and and the American flag would be tagged with everything. And my friend and collaborator on the work, Andrew Salia, had come up with this phrase, "God bless this circuitry," which became a fiction narrative of a father and son who only connect through fixing things that are based on machines and or these church services. The father is pretty clearly a part of this church. The son is made to go and be a part of that church community. And there's illustrations throughout that are all Bible tracts, what are called Christian tracts. People that would stand on the street corners or pass out these pieces of paper, ephemera, that would have imagery to try to draw you in and tell you about religious themes, the gospel, evangelize. In other words, you'll see this on every, a lot of street corners still to this day, right? And then, so the complicated thing is the text, the narratives, each passage of the text has a circuit diagram that links the text to one of these Bible tract images. And when you're reading the text, there's a linkage, literally, on the page, and you're meant in a way to connect them as an illustration, but they don't always follow. So there's this non sequitur approach to how the imagery relates, but is kind of locked into its own iconography of representation, which again is like just part of everyday pop culture stuff that the religious evangelists would use to try to connect to folks.
Yeah, and it even in its broadest form, right? It seems like it's shaped as, and in some sense structured as, sort of like the manual for a car, and
I forgot to mention that part.
Yeah.
So it is like based on a old Saturn car user's manual, almost like almost taken verbatim materially, but then the internal structure is that of a church service. So you have like a prelude, a prayer, and etc. Benediction is toward the end. So yeah, there's this kind of duality throughout that as a whole.
Right. It's a work that I found it hard to get my mind around, to wrap my mind around, because there's so many things going on. And once we're not even talking about, like, there's music that's included with it, right? But it's wonderful, and one of the things that I especially appreciate, it's sort of what you mentioned, all these images from this sort of archive of tracks that you happen to find, and how they're integrated into the story, and sometimes they seem to make sense, sometimes there seems to be more disjunction. Some of those same ideas, and even though that same sort of dialogue emerges in what you've been working on most recently, which is, you don't call them, I understand it, artist books, but artist pamphlets, right? Would you like to talk about these, and maybe Luke in particular?
Sure.
Because it seems very closely connected to this.
Sure. So I'll talk about the material first, and then we'll talk about the pamphlets versus book thing. But so around 10 years ago, not quite 10 years ago, my parents visited, and they brought with them these troves of all my childhood ephemera, including baseball cards and basically a lot of visual stuff that I would collect. My own drawings, comic books, Sports Illustrateds, a lot of religious material, like workbooks from youth group or child education stuff, and it blew my mind that all this stuff still existed. And it also came about at the same time Trump was elected the first time, and there was a lot of discourse about out in the world about kind of manliness and religiosity and patriotism and who's in and who's out, and et cetera. So I started to work with this material, this visual material, to again illustrate like kind of personal stories of kind of questioning my own status, identity status in the world. And Luke was interesting. In particular, it was the first one I did where it pairs pictures of Luke Skywalker found in this trove of stuff with a Bible that was put in a little library on my property where we have a little library. And I just took the Gospel Luke from that Bible and pasted pictures of Luke Skywalker on top, and played with this idea of sort of dominant culture themes and entertainment as a lifelong kind of pursuit, not unlike the way religion becomes and is for a lot of folks. And started exploring what is pretty straightforward, I think, in the myth tales of Star Wars, as well as some of the the gospel tales that come out. So it was a way of kind of getting into this material, thinking through the lens of being a parent. I have a now 9-year-old. When this started, my son was just barely 1, and so kind of thinking through like how he grows up in a culture of images versus how I grew up in a culture of images, and what those bases of images are going to be like. And then the reason they became like pamphlets is because they could have chunked up to be like a whole book, but they had a more immediacy to them. They had more of a part of I wouldn't say like proselytizing or a polemic, but there was always a question that I was trying to get at, and they tended to kind of fall into like a little essay that I would share. And I didn't actually make them. I made them primarily just to share with people. I would make 100 of something and then just send them out to friends and family and connections, colleagues, and then sometimes have conversations about them afterward. So
that's so pamphlets in almost the traditional sense of like sort of a provocative argument or something like that, right?
Yeah. Exactly. A way of a way of engaging, learning, and unlearning, and what those were
Yeah.
gonna, what those are gonna look like in
Yeah.
that era. Yeah.
Yeah.
It started in 2020, and it just kind of kept on.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. There's a series of them. I can't remember. Are there 6 or 7?
There's the 9th one that's coming out.
The 9th
soon.
one. Okay.
Yeah. So there's 8 also.
There's 8
so far.
so far. And I believe you call them so they're artist pamphlets, but the series is Dominance Diaries,
Dominance
and
Diaries,
so they
correct.
deal with different ways of sort of conceiving of power and the way power is structured, especially culturally. Right,
Especially
it
culturally,
seems.
yeah.
More than politically, even, right? Right.
Way more, yeah, definitely more than politically. I mean, there's been a lot of dialogue about identitarian issues, right, for the last, say, 7-8 years, and it became a theme even in this current political election. But this really started from a workshop I took here on campus in DEI. It was like a DEI workshop where I was given a chart at one point in the class, and it had a list of all these dominant identities in the United States, and asked you to chart yourself within this kind of frame of, it was like a didactic. So where are you falling within this dominant status frame? And it would list things like, are you male? Like, yes. Are you white? Culturally, yes. Are you cisgender? Yes. Straight, yes, I just kept linking up with yes. I was like, oh gosh, I'm dominant. Like the whole stack up just became dominant all the way through. English speaking, grew up in a suburb, middle class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So that was an eye opener in a way to understand that from the inside out a little bit more, not from this kind of outside in, this chart that was in it, spelling it back to me. And I think a lot of the criticism publicly is that certain folks do the work of identitarian, research as opposed to others. And so I was trying to okay, I'm dominant, I'm on the power side of this whole spectrum. So how to explore that on that end as opposed to from a marginalized perspective.
I see. It's interesting sort of saying that and for you describing how that for you was sort of like, that was a genesis of insight that led to really interesting art and sort of a new direction. And I guess in every, or pardon me, it's Word and Flesh, right? So, because it seems like there you're like, so that, if I'm describing it correctly, that is sort of, it is images of Jesus,
yes,
right?
Yep.
Were part of your childhood, right? Do you want to talk about that?
There's the opening passage of that book is opening segment is about what I think of as my first memory, which is making a book.
Yeah.
But that's probably
right.
just because I make books now. Yeah. And that memory is of really Abecedary or ABC's book that my mother made with me as a 5-year-old. And within it were a lot of Bible verses and these pictures of a light-skinned, dark-haired, bearded Jesus. Yeah. And the Jesus is, very kind, and he's got, soft features, and there's a lot of ways you can engage. He's with children, and et cetera. And so that's where those questions you might have about representation, how do you represent Jesus? And it's a name that gets thrown around a lot. It's a fascinating icon, but then the icon has specifics. And so what are we going to do now with the specifics? So that whole particular pamphlet was me exploring different words or parts of language in relation to bodies in this case. Yeah.
And for me, that's sort of the most powerful element of that book or way into that book, that's clearly going on, and sometimes you're engaging with these images explicitly in the text. But a lot of the text is also, as you said, sort of you trying to construct a memory, like a story of yourself that explains how you came to be a practitioner of artist books, how you came to be a writer. And and that's and it's really interesting. Like you have this example of how you at one point tattooed the alphabet,
Yes.
right? But without realizing actually what it was, like the alphabet was missing some letters because it was based on an earlier version, right?
17th century abecedary where there was no V, there was no J, there was no, and so I get this thing tattooed on my arm and I think, it's a kind of conceptual way of like I'm becoming a book, and yet, the first person who saw it was like, there's letters missing,
That's
and
right,
so you're
yeah.
having that, there's this kind of like surface level question, and then and then unpacking those surface level questions to get at something a little bit more comprehensive and deep, that we'll start to understand it from a different perspective.
Right, and how and so these images become part of the story that we tell in order to sort of express kind of what we think should be the default, right? This is who I am. I am an artist, and this is who Jesus is. But at the same time, you realize that they're just full of stumbles and mistakes, and you have to kind of reflect on that and think about, like, what do those mistakes actually tell us about who we are? And that's sort of, it seems to me, where you get like at the end of that, where maybe I think you're trying to get at the idea that identity is more interacting with others than what you tell yourself, right?
No, that's it. I mean, so the last passage is of me as a teenager practicing my signature to become an artist that would have a signature, like the way in the frame there is like this Art Institute of Chicago t-shirt that they think they still make, which is all these different artist signatures in a big grid on the t-shirt. I'd been gifted to the materiality and that you're taking away as part of the identity, and it's really the the materiality or that dialogue, that discourse that's interesting, as opposed to you dashing it off,
I would imagine that you're I'm just going to ask you to comment on it. So you open the book, and there are these books of white bearded men who are Jesus, and then there's a white bearded man who's you, very obviously. Like what's going on with that?
Well, so I mean, it was a way in which I could illustrate that. That sort of question of dominance, I guess, a little bit. There's a passage in there. One of the stories in there is about an experience I had in running a graduate program where all the graduate students would, explain what they were working on, and also the faculty. And one day, an art historian in our department said that what she was working on was beards in hiding, and this idea that the emotions are masked by the virile, hirsuteness of somebody's face, and that frame of like the beard being, a way in which queer folks hid in the McCarthy era or whatever. You would have a spouse that was of the other sex and et cetera. So it was a way of putting myself into that position of of dialogue, questioning, like, where is the power? What is the representation here? What am I representing of myself? How do I put myself into this a little bit? Partly because of that bearded question.
I'm curious. We've talked a little before, and I mentioned that some students have found some of the way you've employed religion in some of the more contemporary works offensive. And we are just, even you spoke a lot about ideas in DEI workshops as being for you very provocative and like really helping you sort of make sense of who you are and how you approach your own work. And I'm just wondering, like, do you feel comfortable like reflecting on your work in this current political moment, right? We're just a few weeks into the second Trump administration. There's a lot of changes and transitions, and people are still trying to find their footing and figuring out like what exactly is going on, what kind of country are we going to be, and you're reflecting on a lot of these issues that I think are that people are sensitive to in ways that they haven't always been.
I mean, it's a really tough thing. So the reason I think I started this whole process was the question of empathy, and just like how is empathy going to be employed, and what levels, and I've heard this said a bunch, and something I would repeat though is like, that's a muscle. It goes atrophied if you don't use it. The idea of thinking with another, being with, feeling with somebody else. And this idea that if you don't feel with others or feel with another human, that that could dry up. And so there's these, I think at this point where I had an upbringing, and all the material that is in these diaries I think is reflective of what I would say is a hegemonic, dominant existence, where I grew up in the middle of the United States with a nuclear family, religious, Christian, like I said, English speaking, all the stuff that in some images of where the country could go, that notion of like make America great, or again, it's the again question, right? I had it, but there's still plenty of ways in which that needs to be discussed, thought through. When we're talking about words and flesh, what comes to mind right now in the world is like knowing that Jesus was a Palestinian Jew.
Yeah.
How complicated is that? It's like Jesus was a Palestinian Jew that is, do we even think about there being, Jewish folks in Palestine and Palestinian folks in Israel, and what those overlaps are, or it's so like really an attempt to not stay at the surface level, but to try to explore different parts of this is been the goal. I mean, and I think I say this throughout the diaries quite a bit, but it's largely because of being a parent. I hate to say it, it's just it is as personal as that, where I've got a 9-year-old white boy with blue eyes and almost blonde hair, and he's very cis. He considers himself a boy, and and he's attracted to some of the stuff that I was attracted to as a kid, and it's just trying to explore what that means for him in the future. It is a big question that I would say is still very much worth asking. I'm a part of a family that doesn't agree with half the stuff that I say or do, but I'm still part of that family, and I'm part of a country that I don't agree with half the stuff that goes on, but I'm still a part of that country. So how do you make up an identity without that stuff is I think a strong question that is worth constantly asking.
Yeah. There's this one moment in Luke where you talk in the text about a frustration you have trying to talk to your son about death, right? And it's sort of juxtaposed to the Luke Skywalker images in the Gospel of Luke, and your son just keeps pushing you to want to make a comparison to Pokemon, and you clearly don't want to.
Right.
And it's really just sort of about a kind of impoverishment that everyone, I think, feels. Like with the tools that we've been given to deal with these big cosmic issues, right? And it's just a wonderful moment that I think really is empathetic toward everyone who's tried to explain something that's beyond them. But I want to really thank you, Tate, for this wonderful and rich conversation, and for your beautiful and provocative books. And I also want to thank SUNY Brockport's television studio crew today. The director is Charlotte Toland. The technical directors are Robert Calhoun and Dominic Mruzik. Harley Thomas is on audio. The character generator is Joseph Campbell. Camera was Julia Stepansky, Samuel Robinson, Daniel Bradley. The floor manager was Rachel Ekstrom, and goodbye.